Hi everybody, my name is Gray. I'm a board certified music therapist, and today I'm going to be walking you through my website on alternatives to 12-step programs. So why are we talking about this? 12-step programs continue to be the most popular and widespread accessible peer support recovery programs, and some referrals come from clinicians themselves, and some are required to attend 12-step programs after being involved in the legal system. However, we know from research and anecdotal evidence that a one-size-fits-all model is not really helpful for individuals seeking recovery from substance use disorder and isn't really an accepted way to treat anyone with any disorder or disease. So we want to have options. That's really what this presentation is about. We can acknowledge the life-saving benefits that 12-step programs have historically had, but it's also important that we're honest about the shortcomings and have an awareness of alternatives for clients who might not resonate with the messaging of the 12 steps. So with that, our research question is, what alternatives to 12-step programming are available for individuals with substance use disorders, and how does their programming differ from that 12 steps? So let's get a little bit into the history. We have to know a little bit about the 12 steps to explore alternatives. So 12 steps started with Alcoholics Anonymous, AA, started in the 30s by Bill Wilson. It's been the longest running and most widely accessible peer support program for substance use disorders. And there's been a lot of research on Alcoholics Anonymous and 12-step programs. I got a little bit into it. I looked at a systemic review looking at the efficacy of it, and the outcomes were really promising. So we do want to acknowledge that piece, that AA, NA, other 12-step programs have historically helped people a lot. And with that, we're going to talk about religiosity and disempowerment in the 12 steps. So 7 out of the 12 steps directly refer to spirituality, God, or prayer, so we can immediately see a potential issue with referring non-religious clients to a 12-step program for peer support recovery. Some have also argued that some of the steps include disempowering language. Like if you look at step 1, right there, we admitted we were powerless over alcohol. This really contradicts some trauma-informed language, especially when we're working with trauma survivors, which is usually co-occurring with SUDs. But I wanted to include the steps here for y'all to see, and I bolded every step or portion of a step phrase that directly refers to religion or prayer or includes language that could be perceived as disempowering. So, we can see here, the 12 steps have helped a lot of people. At the same time, this is not a one-size-fits-all model. And I also included a video here from a person who's been through AA, and now she is a speaker, and she has a book about her experiences with AA. And she talks about, very similar things to what I'm saying. Like, we can acknowledge how great it's been for some people, but we also need to talk about the flaws, and we need to really be honest with them, because right now, 12 steps dominates peer support recovery programs. So risk and protective factors, I included some relevant risk and protective factors for substance use disorders in general. For example, we know risk factors include social marginalization, a lack of community, unhealthy or ambivalent social norms, and financial barriers to care, which is why peer support programs like the 12 steps are important. Because they address those factors of social marginalization and having a community that has similar goals to you and have similar experiences, and it's a free program. So it's relevant to all those risk factors. And we also know protective factors for SUDs are an internal locus of control, positive peer influence, opportunities to contribute positively, a strong community, and opportunities for pro-social action, which are all things that a peer support program can provide for someone in recovery. And I did include this internal locus of control bit right here, kind of to tie back to the idea of powerlessness in the 12 steps and the idea of like turning your power over to God, which kind of contradicts this protective factor for SUDs of having an internal locus of control, being like, I am in control of what I do in my future. So food for thought on that. This is a quote from one of the research articles I looked at. Most people receiving treatment for an alcohol or drug use disorder do not sustain involvement in 12-step groups at levels where benefits can be expected. So what puts someone at risk to drop out from a 12-step program? Lower religiosity is a huge one. There was a significant not correlation. There was a nice p-value for this one in this study. Abstinence not being the primary recovery goal, that puts you at risk to drop out of 12 steps. Low motivation for change or treatment, and less belief in the disease model of addiction. And before I get into the actual alternatives, I just want to say I am coming from the place where I am someone who did a 12-step program for a while and did not particularly enjoy it, and preferred other models of recovery. So I am coming from like a clinical perspective and a personal one. I tried to be as objective as possible in my paper, but if you see any bias hop out, it's probably where it's coming from. But let's get into some alternatives, because there's so many alternatives. I only covered 5 in my paper because if I covered all of them, I would have wrote a book. The first one and the biggest one is SMART recovery. They were established in 1994, and SMART stands for self-management and recovery training. It's secular and evidence-informed with roots in rational emotive behavioral therapy and cognitive behavioral therapy. They really emphasize being a part of your own treatment program, and while they don't encourage they do encourage abstinence, it's not a requirement to participate, which is the case for most of these alternatives that I'm going to go over. There's a lot of online and in-person groups offered, probably more than any of these alternatives, and they really focus on the here and now in the meetings, and every member of the meeting can put forward agenda items to discuss themselves. There is also some research for SMART recovery. A longitudinal study comparing 12-step groups to SMART groups found that there's no difference in efficacy between 12-step and SMART. So they're equally as effective. And then another study found that SMART recovery members were significantly less likely to endorse abstinence as their primary recovery goal in comparison to those in 12-step programs. So we can already see potentially better for a harm reduction approach. And I got a little video from them and a link to their website. And now we got LifeRing, probably the next biggest one. This one is established in 1997, and their approach is centered around the 3S philosophy: sobriety, secularity, and self-help. And again, participants are encouraged to design their own recovery program, and there's no hierarchical structure for the organization, so different from 12 steps already. They offer in-person, online groups, and a lot of online resources. And they were also part of the longitudinal study that I looked at. They compared 12 steps to like multiple alternatives, and LifeRing, there was also no difference between LifeRing and 12 steps, so equally as effective as 12 steps. Moderation management. So now we're getting into the alternatives that are really harm reduction based. So this one was 1994. The only requirement to join is, quote, a willingness to change your relationship with alcohol in a positive manner, end quote. So that you don't have to want to quit. Abstinence doesn't need to be your primary goal to be a part of this program, which is really helpful for people who are not ready to quit yet. And their program is centered around the steps of change, which you can find on their website, and I didn't want to make this page ridiculous and wordy. And they have online meetings and a Facebook community, and also a link on their website to find moderation-friendly therapists, and they don't do sponsorship. They do recommend a 30-day abstinence period, referred to as the 30, but it's not a requirement to join. HAMS, stands for Harm Reduction, Abstinence, and Moderation Support for Alcohol. And their program is rooted in the 17 elements, which encourage members to analyze their drinking habits, set their own goals, develop coping skills, track their drinking, and evaluate after relapses. They do offer some online meetings, but this is largely a self-guided program, which would make this beneficial for someone who's looking to reduce their drinking or substance use and doesn't have time to do a virtual or in-person meeting, or maybe has some social anxiety, but is still looking for a structured way to engage in safer substance use behaviors. And they also have a book and some articles on their website. I will say their website is pretty outdated, so that is the one drawback with this one. Refuge Recovery. This one was founded recently in 2014. They describe themselves as a practice, a process, a set of tools, a treatment, and a path to healing addiction and suffering caused by addiction. It's rooted in Buddhist principles, the Four Noble Truths, and the Eightfold Path. And they kind of systemize these philosophies in their recovery program. They do not require that you believe in a higher power to participate. But this one might be ideal for someone who is spiritual but not religious, maybe didn't like the disempowering language of the 12 steps, but appreciated the spirituality and is looking for something with a little bit more, same spirituality, but maybe more empowering language. So now we know about a few alternatives to 12 steps. And remember, these are just 5. There were like at least 10 when I looked. And like community-specific ones, like Women for Recovery, stuff like that. Highly encourage you all to go take a peek. There's a lot out there. So implications for social workers. Social workers have to ensure that they are centering the dignity and worth of a person. And because 12-step programs cannot be universally applied, it's vital for social workers and any clinician to have other peer support programs to refer clients to, especially if those clients are non-religious. We also know the importance of human relationships, which is core to this whole project. We know that human relationships are such a strong vehicle for positive change, and we want to be able to refer people to a variety of peer support programs, not just one. And competence. We have to stay up to date on professional and clinical knowledge. And when we apply this to peer support-based recovery, we have to be familiar with several options. And we just want to be culturally sensitive and give people choices so that we can actually meet them where they're at, instead of being like, you should go to a 12-step program. Works for a lot of people. So human rights. This is from Undoing Drugs. I was in a book group with some of you, so you might be familiar with this quote. They were talking about experiences in an NA program, and I'll start the quote. This means that if you treat your addiction with methadone, even if you comply perfectly with every other aspect of the program and are saintly and super productive, you are not allowed to raise your hand and share at most NA meetings or count the days since you last used other drugs to set your recovery date. In NA's language, you are not considered clean with such substances in your body. And I'm sure we all have our wee-woo, like social worker alarms going off. All right. So the abstinence-only programming, that's a huge drawback of 12 steps. We have to meet people where they're at. Furthermore, we know from research that about 40% of people participating in a 12-step group will drop out, and their recovery outcomes are markedly worse after dropping out. We know that lower motivation to change or stop substance use is a risk factor for dropping out of a 12-step program too. So if you are trying to help someone get into a community to help them recover, and they might not be fully ready to change, throwing them into a program where it's like abstinence or bust, that's not going to help. That's going to isolate them further. Religion and the 12 steps, we've already hit this home, but they rely heavily on the philosophies of Christianity, and we know that lower religiosity is a risk factor for dropping out of a 12-step group. And just in language, like referring someone who is non-religious or has religious trauma to a group that relies so heavily on Christian values is culturally insensitive. And we know that 1 in 3 Americans has some kind of religious trauma, with LGBTQ plus Americans being the worst affected. So keep that in mind. We also know from anecdotal evidence that individuals with trauma have spoken up about how the 12-step model did not feel like an appropriate fit due to language inherent in the steps that directly contradicts language that clinicians use to help trauma survivors empower themselves. And this was my experience as well, to be honest. Another huge issue is mandated recovery. Research indicates that about 60% of poop-luke, Public treatment programs for SUDs in the US utilize the 12-step model as their primary approach, and the majority of them encourage or mandate 12-step involvement. We know that forced treatment doesn't work based on the available evidence, and we can recognize how these programs have helped people, but kind of coercing them into them is not the way to do that. So our conclusion: more toolbox in your toolbox. More toolbox in your toolbox. More tools in your toolbox is always a good thing. It's still, AA, 12 steps, NA, still the most widely known and accessible peer support program, but it cannot be the only one that we are referring to. We need to have a knowledge of a variety of peer support services. And unfortunately, there's limited research on the efficacy of alternatives to 12 steps, whereas 12 steps has a whole big chunk of research. So there needs to be more research in this area, and we need to familiarize ourselves with alternatives to 12 steps and know what kind of alternatives might fit for different kinds of clients that we're working with, depending on their background and their needs. So yeah, that is my presentation. Here are my references. I hope you enjoyed. Have a great last week. Take care.